and today is the 153rd Security Thought Leadership webinar. And for those of us who join us regularly, and that's many of you, what we tend to do on these webinars is we choose an issue and we critique it. And our idea today is not trying to solve the world's problems. The idea today is to try and give thoughts, ideas, explain concepts. What are the barriers to progress and how might we tackle them? Where are the good ideas and how might we enhance them? And the topic today is one that is of great interest to me. And this one was actually suggested to me. Normally we come up with them here, but this was actually suggested to me. Fraudulent degrees and qualifications, problems and potential remedies. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves. And once they've done that, I will then invite them to make an opening statement, 3 minutes, when they get to say whatever they want to say about the subject matter. And then what we'll do is we'll come to you, the audience, and invite you to ask questions. We ask you please to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And will you please get your questions in as soon as you can? And then I'll endeavour to incorporate them in the conversation. Without further ado then, let's go and meet our panelists. And first of all, let's go and meet Gavin. Gavin.
Hi everybody, hi Martin, hi Keith. My name's Gavin Burton. I'm an identity consultant. I represent a company called Qualification Check. I've been immersed in identity crime for well over 10 years now, both within policing and also in the private sector.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. And Keith, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Rosser. I'm a group director at Reed, who are the world's largest family-owned recruitment business. And part of my role is I run a large pre-employment screening business for Reed. So very interested from both sides of the agenda today. Yeah, fascinating. And that's, of course, what makes you interesting panelists for us. I should say, audience, you will be expecting Chris Rea to join us. We're hoping he will, but we're going to get going anyway with Gavin and Keith. Thank you very much indeed, chat. So let's get going. Gavin, can we have your opening statements? 3 minutes for your thoughts on this subject matter, please.
Yeah, so my initial thought is around qualification verification. Whenever I speak to people, whether it's in private or public sector, nobody's actually aware that you can do it. So that's a big issue, first of all. You know, you can verify identity documents in the blink of an eye with the technology that's out there now. And nobody thinks twice about the fact that you can actually verify somebody's qualification, whether that's a higher education or high school. From a qualification check point of view, we work internationally. So we do monitor our fraud rates across certain countries. And these can really vary. We've got fraud rates in terms of non-verified education credentials from as much as about 12.9% in America to about 2.2% in the UK. And it will vary from country to country. Somebody's going to ask me why. I won't be able to answer that. But it's what I can foresee is that in time, certainly we've got in the UK talking about identity, the digital identity trust framework that we have here, along with the right to work rules, that you've got trust frameworks in Australia and other countries around the world, that you've certainly got the possibility to have digital education credentials as part of your digital identity that can be reused, that will make that whole system far more secure.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I mean, fascinating. As you say, some of this can be done and yet we're not using it. We'll come on to that in a minute, of course. Don't forget, if you have got questions, please get them in early and we'll incorporate them into the discussion. I mean, it is fascinating to me that such a major issue doesn't have a solution, but perhaps we'll get into that in a minute. Keith, can we have your thoughts, please, on this topic? Your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Martin. So it's generally believed that a third of all job seekers lie on their CV, and in particular, that is around exaggerating or just fabricating their qualifications. So it's a big number of people who perhaps are misrepresenting themselves. In the UK, the CIFAS, the UK's fraud sharing organisation, have believed this is also a number on the rise. And yet only 63% of employers actually check qualifications in the first place. And the level of checking they do varies wildly from, as Gavin has said, proper sort of online verification through to just looking at what someone's declared on a CV. So 1/3 are lying and only 2/3 of employers are checking. What's some of the problems around this? Well, qualifications are paper-based generally, and that's a real challenge for employers. How do employers properly check qualifications? And what about a charge? Some services charge employers. So should employers be paying for this service? What are the risks to employers of not paying for such services? But it's not also just degree qualifications. What about accreditations or training certificates? In some sectors, like healthcare, people declaring they're first aid trained or moving and handling trained can actually have really dangerous consequences if they're not. So finally, in terms of what do we do about this? Well, we've long seen this as a real multi-stakeholder sort of solution, if you like. We need people to come together across the tech world, the employment world, academics, to look at how we could properly create an ecosystem for employers to quickly and correctly check the claims of job seekers. There's an interesting national discussion group at the moment going on, led by an MP, John Penrose in the UK, looking at how we could verify qualification credentials online. And I was also interested recently to see the example that France is setting with a new online platform the French government have helped to sponsor, which allows employers in France to check degree qualifications for any French university. So there are some solutions out there, but they're generally fragmented. And what we're looking for is a really strong sort of cross-stakeholder solution that helps employers to eradicate this problem.
Keith, thank you very much indeed. Well, look, an immediate question comes to my mind is that, Keith, you present this, and I'll come to you second, you present this as we're looking for a way of checking this more holistically, perhaps, my words, not yours. But Gavin, you imply we could do it now.
Yeah, you can. I mean, it's the systems are out there where, or the companies are out there that have the systems that have the links into certain countries that can check those credentials. And you know, without this being too much of a plug in terms of qualification check, the system is good from the point of view that it covers over 192 countries and 40,000 different education establishments. So it's wide ranging. And people don't realise that the ability is there, that you can do that. As Keith said, you know, that paper-based system, you get a GCSE certificate presented to you in front of you, and a lot of people will just look at it and say, okay. These are not like identity documents that conform to international standards. These are very much ad hoc from one institution to another. And it's very important that there's that link to the institution that can say, yes, that person did attend that course, you know, or, yeah, actually, that's not their grade. They might have inflated their grade, or they might not have even paid for their course. There are really lots and lots of reasons when I mentioned around fraud or not being verified that can mean that you're not verified.
But I just want to check though, Gavin, so I'm clear. This system that does exist, what's the problem with it then? Because Keith's presenting, I'll come to Keith in a second, but Keith said it was a problem. So what's the problem if it already exists?
Well, if you're asking me, I can't see a problem.
Right, let me go to Keith. Keith, let me come to you then. I mean, you presented it as fragmented and you need someone to get a grip. My words, not yours. I mean, what's wrong with what Gavin's just said?
Well, firstly, there's what you might call the training provision sector. So people training people on first aid courses or whatever else it might be. Those types of qualifications generally don't sit anywhere in terms of online platforms that can be checked. Very much employers are relying on a paper certificate that can be really low quality from the private sector training providers. So my first problem is that any solution that we've seen isn't cross-cutting and that it covers all types of qualifications. They generally sit towards the more educational establishment end of the market. The second problem is sort of even within these sectors they do cover is a problem of time. So certain solutions are relying on universities, particularly in the UK, to follow a process, which can often delay the hiring process. And employers have got a time v cost versus sort of effort formula to go through each time, which means that quite often employers don't bother to do it if they think it's going to extend the process. So I think generally the challenge is it fast enough? And does it cover every type of qualification and sort of training accreditation out there are the two main challenges.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, I'm sure this will crop up in a second. Let's go on to deal with some of the questions that are coming in. I'm going to come first of all to Gavin, if I might. And Stuart Osborne's got a question, Gavin, and it's about how the checks are done. And I think it's a good question because back to Keith's point, I mean, how good are those checks?
Well, it can vary from country to country. So we will have people in various different parts of the world who can help with like translating some of those more difficult qualifications. But what we have seen is that you can basically have a portal where you can upload your credentials. It will then go off to the institution who will confirm those. There is a certain amount of manual input. You can't get away from that. Like I say, it's not like verifying an ID document. There's and each region is different from one place to another. So one country, for example, might actually want a copy of the actual degree certificate. Another might want a transcript. Others might want to have consent forms that are signed and uploaded that they've got before they do the check. Whereas other countries, I think it's America, we don't need consent because the law's there. So there are those type of issues. Generally though, in terms of time, I think on a kind of global average, we kind of average around about 3.5 days for a check to come back. But again, it will vary from country to country.
Okay, that we're beginning to get the heart of this now. This is beginning to make sense. Okay, really, really interesting. Keith, let me come to you next. A question from Mike Gibbs, who's based in the United States, former panelist. And Mike says, we hear a lot of talk about the 4-year education is losing favour, especially in cyber, to be replaced by short-term courses or certificates by universities, associations, institutions, etc. Does this make this problem worse, more places to check, or better, new places more likely to allow digital checks? Good question.
Yeah, fantastic question. And I hope I'm not being perverse by saying I think the answer is both. I think in the short term, it makes the problem worse. The kind of micro courses creating more and more things that need to be checked by employers will, to begin with, I think cause more problems and probably lead to even fewer than those 63% I quoted at the start doing any checking at all. But then to the mid to long term, I agree with Mike's observation that actually the opportunity is there to create proper digital credentialing by institutions that are more likely and geared up to do it. Gavin mentioned in his starter the rise of digital identity, and something that's very key to what's happening in the UK right now, and many other countries in the world have already done this. And I think the idea of sort of digital careers and digital credentialing for jobs is definitely one on the horizon, but I think it will probably take a little longer yet. So worse in the short term, better long term.
I'm going to come back to digital identity in a minute because I've got a question sent in advance, but let me just get Gavin on this issue. Do you agree with Keith's answer to Mike Gibbs' question about good or bad?
Yeah, I do. And I certainly agree with what Keith has said earlier and what he's just said there. For example, the psychology profession, there are multiple bodies that govern the psychology profession. And it depends whether you're university educated to whether you've actually had life experience and you're counselling somebody. So that is a particular sector where it's very difficult to verify someone's credentials. In terms of those micro courses, I fully agree with Keith that it poses a slight problem in the short term, but longer term, when you've got digital credentials and as that digital ecosystem grows, then it's only going to be beneficial.
And this point about digital identity, so I've got a question in advance, and he asked precisely about this, about the potential of the digital identity. Let me come first to all of you, because you did mention it in your opening statement. Now, this seems to the holy grail. What What's the barrier to that being successful? Because that's ideal, isn't it? It just seems perfect. What's the problem?
Yeah, well, there's multiple barriers. There's infrastructure, so there's technology. There's companies that might just not be geared up to accept those digital identity checks. There is a cost element. Everything costs money in some respect. So there are those multiple issues, as well as it being slightly in its infancy as well. And that's why you've got the various different trust frameworks around the world that all kind of ask the same kind of questions. What you don't want with a digital identity is somebody getting into your digital identity ecosystem with, for instance, a fraudulently obtained genuine passport. Because once they're in the candy store, they've got access to all of the sweets. And there are all of these kind of problems that do need to be ironed out. But I think we are slowly getting there.
Okay, Keith, do you see it in the same terms? I mean, is it the Holy Grail? Am I right? Or has it got more problems?
So this is a topic very close to my heart, as I've been sat on the strategy board with DCMS and UK government working on digital identity for about last year. In particular, my area of responsibility has been the hiring use case. And we worked first with DCMS and more recently with Home Office to implement digital identity for right to work checks for all UK employers, which goes live next month or in April. So very close to this. And I think digital identity has a lot of potential benefit to employers to be checking their right to work, check their proof of address, other types of credentials we can attach to digital identity. And eventually, very much I see it as being part of the answer to digital credentials. There is a challenge in the UK, and one particularly that I'm very concerned about, especially after the way to work and levelling up agendas that have been announced recently, is that many people in the UK who would be wanting to get a job on a digital identity haven't got valid in-date passports. So if you haven't got a valid in-date passport, you can't get a formal digital identity with the government and therefore get a job digitally remotely. So think about all those people in employment black spots that haven't got many local job opportunities, hoping to get more opportunities by applying for work online, suddenly can't do it through digital identity. So I do see it as part of the overall future solution, but right now we've got some real challenges to making this work.
And just the one that Gavin said about security of it, presumably that's the ultimate, I guess. I mean, how secure is it right now?
Well, did a survey of over 400 employers last Thursday, and 75% of them said it is more secure than the current method of checking for employment. So the current method of checking, either face-to-face or using Zoom or Teams to check people's identity and credentials, 75% of them believe that this step up to digital identity is more secure. But there are a number of challenges though with that. It's not as perfect as people probably think it is.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, let's move on, chaps. Lots of questions coming in. Dennis Shep from Canada, another former panelist, says, and Gavin, let me come to you first. This surely is another nail on the head. A huge issue are degree mills and false credentials out of different parts of the world. Traditionally using a local PI was the source to verify validity. Is there another method now? Massive problems, we agree, Gavin, first?
Yeah, massive problems. And I think it's a massive problem all over the world. You know, in terms of, I say fraud, but what's not verified in terms of what we see worldwide, internationally. We're always about a year behind on our figures in any case, but in 2020, about 3.4% of all of our verifications were not verified in one form or another. Now, degree mills are going to feed that, you know, and when I say not verified, you know, somebody may submit a false degree certificate from a completely made up university that they've got offline, that somebody's just paid £20 or $20 for a certificate. The system that we have will instantly not recognise that because it's not a real establishment, an institution. But yeah, they are a real problem. And unless you are validating or verifying that qualification at source, it may as well just be a piece of paper or any piece of paper.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Mark Rose says. I mean, of course, it could be a genuine certificate, but doesn't belong to the right person. I mean, what's right, all these problems? I assume exist in their different ways, and some are easier to check than others.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a little case study here. In about 2016, there was a British paedophile that got convicted in the UK. He was meant to sign on to the sex offenders register to be monitored. The following day after his conviction, he disappeared into the ether. About a year ago, he turns up in Spain, and he has basically committed child sexual offences. And he was working at an English school in the Costa del Sol. And basically, the news article for that produced all of his documentation, of which was his genuine certificate, but with just the surname photoshopped out. And he basically said, well, I'm sorry, you know, I can't get my certificate at the moment because it's in England and I'm in Spain. Will a PDF do? So had they have checked that, I mean, certificates will generally have numbers. They will be verified for people. Potentially a child could have been saved.
Yeah, absolutely. Horrendous. I'll come to you as well, if I might, Keith, on this, because it's a biggie, about this mill from different parts of the world churning out these certificates. And I guess we all look for it, and it's just, the scale of the problem is enormous. Is there an easy way of recognising this?
I don't think there is, because the international element makes this far more complicated for employers, because whichever country the employer's in, they can't be they can't be able to spot a fraudulent degree qualification from the other side of the world. It's hard enough as a UK employer to spot UK fraudulent degree certificates, but when you suddenly introduce fake degree mills, fake online universities from other parts of the world, even harder for UK employers to spot that that's a fake. So the global nature of it, the online nature of the sort of fraud, and then the size of the degree mill market makes it really hard for employers, as I say, to even spot domestic fraud, let alone sort of international fraud. So it's a real challenge for employers.
I'm going to ask, yeah, go on, Gavin. Yeah, come on.
No, sorry. Just on that point, I think as well that with HEAD, they actually had a URL checker within their website. So where they were working with police, they'd actually identified a number of false websites, and they'd actually published the URLs of these, or of well-known names of completely fictitious institutions. Certainly, when I was in policing, it was always a bit of a game of cat and mouse. We would identify the websites, apply to the National Crime Agency to get them removed. They'd remove them within a couple of hours, they'd be set up again. And, you know, unfortunately, the internet is a little bit like bandit country in that respect.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, Keith, let me come back to you and a question for you, which I want to put across. We just heard the story about the paedophile, the case study, and of course that's extreme. But Keith, let me just put this to you. When we talk about how, I'm going to ask you how big a deal is this, but I'm not thinking about the figures which show. I'm just thinking that people might exaggerate a bit on their application form for a job. Okay, look, it's not on, they shouldn't do it. But I'm just wondering how big a deal this is in the great scheme of things, of all the frauds out there and all the worries we've got about where we should play this. And I get the point about the paedophile, that is extremely serious. Is that common? Keith first.
Thanks, Martin. So for me, it is a big deal. It's a big deal for a number of different reasons. Firstly, that someone who exaggerates their qualification might just get that job ahead of someone who hasn't exaggerated the qualification. So suddenly it's a fairness issue in the job application process. And clearly job interviews and applications are competitive, but you want them to be fairly competitive. So I think that's problem number one, people unfairly getting a job ahead of somebody else. Problem number two is employers may employ someone who is not as capable as they make out. And actually the idea of the sort of Peter principle and people in jobs that are perhaps beyond their level of competency is a real challenge. So there's always the danger for employers that they're relying on that qualification that might not be true or real. Problem number three is the sort of darker form of the issue, which is the organised fraud aspect. So people who are deliberately trying to get into organisations that, I think Martin and Gavin, you made this point earlier, to defraud that organisation and to do harm, which is on the sort of darker side. And then finally, I'd say that yes, the paedophile issue is rare, but actually people working in the UK Health Service and the NHS losing their job because of fake qualifications, I would say is certainly a quarterly, if not a monthly occurrence. So it's a real big challenge for employers for lots of different reasons.
Okay, Gavin, is Keith exaggerating this in this way?
No, he's not. He's hit the nail on the head. And in the UK, you can search the disciplinary hearings for the GMC, the Nursing Midwifery Council, and you've only got to have a look and read of some of these things that you can see that people will use false education certificates or credentials to try and get that job. Dentists.
My point is, though, Gavin, so what? I mean, look, I just.
But it's a point of honesty, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Integrity.
I mean, of course, I'm not justifying this. I'm just trying to sort of draw the scale of it, right? Of all we've had lots of these webinars have been about different types of frauds, and I get the sort of figures you produce about, so many people are not telling the truth. But I mean, if they just say they got a GCSE they didn't 30 years ago, well, okay, it's not acceptable, but that's not the end of the world. I mean, I'm interested in the scale of the problem in terms of what difference it makes by and large.
Well, I think what you've got is like Keith said, you've got somebody who might not be able to actually physically do that job, whether it's through a competency thing or through a lack of training. But the point being is that corporately, as an organisation, you've allowed somebody into your organisation that has now got access to either sensitive material or vulnerable people when they shouldn't have, and it poses a risk. It's an unknown risk, and from you can say, well, I've just overinflated my grades just to get my maths, but actually you're doing somebody else out of a job as well.
Yeah, okay, I understand that, and I think it's just worth putting that on the agenda because the consequences can be severe, and it does matter. Okay, let me move on, and let me come back to you, Keith, if I might. Jennifer Siofi has written in, is there a best methodology for checking work experience from a now closed down organisation? It's a good point, this, Keith. Specifically, right, and I'll come to Gavin afterwards, in this environment post-COVID and all that's gone with it. Keith first.
Yeah, it's a really big problem these days, Martin, because of COVID, as you've mentioned. Lots of organisations no longer exist, and work seekers are coming with sort of fragmented work histories or work histories from organisations that no longer exist. So it's a real challenge. Clearly, in terms of verifying people's work history, the primary route is normally the reference, which is challenging in the case of organisation that's closed down. Beyond that, we recommend that people check things like first and last payments from organisations through bank statements to check that individual did actually work where they claim that they worked, to ensure at least that period of work is genuine. They weren't doing something else or hiding employment they don't want to share. And then beyond that, there might be other types of experts that you could go to. So it's whether there's accountants or sort of third parties surrounding that place of work. It depends what the job was, clearly, who could verify and validate. And then finally, we do also see some firms still seek to approach previous senior managers of the organisation who have since moved on to a different organisation and get them to vouch for it. But it is really challenging, particularly since COVID has changed so many things. But genuinely, we say bank statements to confirm dates with a few other ideas to confirm if needed.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm going to come to you, Gavin, if I might. And we've got a question from Stephen Sendy, who says, are there potential benefits in artificial intelligence? I wonder whether, Gavin, there are solutions on the horizon that can perhaps add some depth to getting over this issue, specifically, I think, with organisations that are closed down, tracking work histories as a consequence. And you agree with Keith?
Yeah, I do. Certainly, as just reinforcing what Keith said there, if if you've been employed in a regulated sector, then you can go back to the body. But the difficulty that's posed is, if I said that I worked for Woolworths back in 1999, well, they went bust in 2007. Where are the records? Who were your former work colleagues, etc.? It's a real problem. In terms of AI, it could potentially be used to recognise certain certificates. If you had like a repository of certificates, although it's huge, it's used in that particular way for things like identity documents. So to try and detect identity document fraud, where certain fonts are used or where certain words are spelt correctly. So that there is potentially a place for AI. In terms of verifying the credential, I don't know where, but certainly from a physical certificate point of view, quite possibly.
Yeah, we got a webinar in March on specifically on AI. I may bring that one up with the relevant experts there. I mean, Keith, I mean, this point about AI, we do tend to see it as the holy grail. In your world, with the work you discussed earlier, where you've been doing, is this cropping up as the solution to all our problems? Don't worry, AI will solve it.
So two ways we've seen AI slowly being adopted in the employment space. The first is around making selections about job candidates. So using AI to determine of the 10 CVs received, which 5 might be taken forward to interview. And it's a really fascinating debate, that first use case, because there's a lot of pros and cons. I noticed that the TUC last year came out and said they are lobbying for to always be a human decision maker in the job process and not to rely on AI. So they sit on one end of the scale, through to organisations at the other end of the scale who obviously see the benefit of the efficiency model. We're also seeing AI potentially around what's being discussed here and sort of validating people's credentials. There's a big debate about the use of blockchain or other ledger-based technology and how that eventually could help with this situation. I think one of the challenges with job searching is that a lot of people aren't generally recognizing the fact they might be job searching soon. So it's not like it's not a repeat purchase transaction where having a digital identity or digital credential is something you do because you're doing a repeat purchase, so it makes sense. If I've worked for Reed for 18 years and I'm not particularly thinking I'm looking for a new job this year, and if I were, would I set up my own digital sort of credentials or blockchain to do so? Probably not. So we are seeing AI and blockchain as a debate, but I wouldn't say quite yet it's the answer to everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my colleague actually in perpetuity, a researcher, Dr. Janice Goldstraw-White, who sometimes chairs these meetings. I mean, she's our internal expert on fraud, and of course, one of the issues is about all the potential solutions and making them. We do keep coming back to the importance of the human element. You know, it just doesn't seem to go away, and we'll return to that. Okay, Gavin, I want to try and get a couple more questions if I might. Keith Nielsen's asking about the scale of it. Now, Gavin, we mentioned the fact that that there was some indication from CFAS earlier that it was actually increasing, but there's an issue here about, okay, so the employer can check. And if the employer doesn't check, well, so be it. But is there a liability there? I mean, is it dangerous not to check? I didn't check Janice's when she joined us, but, you know, she's well known, she's experienced, and, you know, she's lovely. I mean, you don't check. Does it matter in that sense? I mean, you're liable.
I would say it does matter, but I would say that knowing what my history is from the police. So I'm a very cynical person, as it's been pointed out many times. But I think there is the potential. Well, I suppose it comes down to a certain extent of employment law as well, which I'm certainly not an expert on by any stretch of the imaginations. But there's got to be questions asked if it is discovered later on down the line that somebody who's been employed for 20 odd years as a nurse has, you know, got false education certificates that supported them getting employed in the first place, regardless of the fact that they've done all their kind of annual CPD and may have passed it. So that there will obviously be either disciplinary or employment law implications with that.
Yeah,
once it's detected. But I think the issue is we don't know what we don't know. It's a little bit like I say this with identity crime. You never know what is getting through the system because you just don't know.
well, that's right. I mean, I'm going to come to that in a second, actually, funny enough. But let me just go to Keith first, because I'd like your view on this, because this is this liability. You're right at the heart of this, I would have thought. I mean, is there a liability on an organisation that doesn't carry out checks, places someone in a position who then commits some offence against some victim? Has that victim got any recourse?
Well, that's a really good question. So when you talk about an organisation placing somebody, that you've got sectors like the recruitment sector. So the recruitment industry obviously places people into roles. Now, there is legislation that governs the recruitment industry, particularly around vetting of job candidate applicants, and particularly when working with vulnerable people. So in the education and healthcare sectors, the legislation states that they must be qualified to do the job. So it doesn't go into detail about how to confirm they are qualified, but it does put the onus on the recruitment agency to ensure they are qualified for work such as teaching, healthcare, etc. So therefore, by extension, if a recruitment agency placed a worker who did something awful, then that recruitment organisation would be liable either by the organisation they placed the person with or with the individual. I suspect the individual, the victim, would take action against the hospital, for example, who would then pass the liability to the recruitment agency.
Yeah, I mean, do you see this much though? I mean, is it a worry?
Yeah, is it a worry? Yes, it is a worry, and I think in most of the proper decent recruitment organisations, vetting candidates in the healthcare and education sectors is a very serious thing that they do, and they put a lot of time, a lot of effort into doing it. The problems are less, I would say, about the recruitment agency, the good ones, wanting to do it. The problem is in the fallibility of the records they're checking. I mean, as an example I gave earlier, if we want to know that a healthcare assistant who don't have professional qualifications, remember, so these are unqualified people, unqualified care assistants claim to be first aid trained by a piece of paper that they've printed off at home that could be, they claim, from St John's Ambulance. If they then go and do something dreadful when trying to resuscitate somebody, that's a serious issue. But how can the employer check that?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, the more we're getting into this, the more we're beginning to get an insight into some of the sort of knock-on consequences of why all this matters. Thank you very much indeed. Let me come back to you, Gavin, if I might. In fact, it's the issue you just raised about Stuart Osborne's got this point about, do people really know, do employers really know what checks are being done? I mean, there's one thing to say, we don't check. Well, then, as you said earlier, that's, you take your risk with that. That's that, fair enough. But there's also this point about what is a reasonable amount of checks to do. I mean, one of the things that I've always done is I've always rung the referees rather than written to them, because you feel as though that in a conversation you get more of a bit. But I'm not in an area, I don't think, where this is very sensitive. Gavin, your thoughts about, do employers really know what they're doing even when they're doing it, how thorough it is?
I think it will vary from organisation and
Sure.
to who's actually doing the actual recruitment process. If I'm honest, there are issues with referees to a certain extent as well, like you say about ringing them up. There have been cases where you've had people sitting in call centres just waiting to pick the phone up with your CV, just to verify that you were at this non-existent job. It's a big industry for the fraudsters.
Yeah.
So they go to ever increasing lengths to basically ply their trade, really.
Yeah, and I guess the sort of casual attitude from many, and the difficulty of making it work, rather plays into their hands. I mean, we've had this conversation with offenders before who've come on and spoken about it. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the things you learn from offenders is that really it's looking for the easy opportunity. And this is one which is clearly very, very easy. I mean, sorry, go on, Gavin. Finish.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, and just leading on also from Keith's point and talking about liability, is that if you are an employer, especially thinking about illegal working, And if you have been put into the crosshairs of immigration enforcement in terms of illegal working, then in terms of liability, you as an organisation are potentially in a world of pain, because immigration enforcement never normally come on their own. They'll invariably come with the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, they'll have HMRC, they'll have DWP and possibly police as well. And as an organisation, you might be submitted to a very much a longer term and in-depth immigration audit, where they'll look at absolutely every employee, maybe not just the one or two illegal workers that might have slipped through the net.
Now, of all the things you said to me, that one, as you said, is real pain. That would not be good. Keith, this point about Stuart Osborne's asking about whether employers really know. I mean, there is a supplementary question here about whether they really know about, you know, the sorts of problems that are cropping up and the likelihood of these occurring. And I know it's going to vary, and I know we can only speak in general terms, but I mean, the more I'm hearing from you two, the more I'm beginning to think, goodness me, Keith.
So I think to answer your and Stuart's question about do employers really know what they're looking for, probably not is the honest answer. I think there's two camps here. I think one camp is we just do the checking and vetting because we're told we have to do it, and it's the path of least resistance. So do we want to find problems? No. So if we get a reference back that ticks a box, we'll tick a box and then we've done it, and then we're covered. So I think you've got we just follow painting by numbers to just make sure it's done, and then we can move on. And then you've got the organisations that probably do take this seriously or more seriously and want to do more than just follow the sort of painting by numbers approach and want to actually get it right and want to dig. And the problem for them, though, is do they really understand it? You know, vetting and checking of would-be employees is generally done by HR, hiring or talent acquisition departments. It's not done by fraud departments. And so are they well equipped enough, understanding enough of what's happening? Certainly not, would be my view.
Yeah, funny enough, a senior, let's just say a very senior person in the world actually wrote to me the other day and gave an example when he was in charge of an organisation, and he wrote to them and said there's fraudulent applications here. And your point, Keith, they needed the person, they appointed this individual in the end, they just ignored him. This is an HR issue, mind your own business. We need to get this get this sorted. Final question by Mike Gavin. We've only got a couple of minutes left. In fact, we haven't really got that. Gavin, Jennifer come in and said, is there a difference in the ability to check credentials from now defunct private education institutes? Very quickly.
Very good point. And we may have to get back to her on that. Certainly there are some institutions that change their names, but they will still verify previous credentials of previous students that have been there when organisations have amalgamated.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you very much indeed. Listen, fascinating. Lots of questions, very engaged, very, very informed. I'm now more worried than I was before, which is always been interesting. Panel, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed, the audience. A few final points, if I might, because we're running out of time. Just to say to you, the Outstanding Security Performance Awards, they're open in Kenya until 21st of February. They're open in Nigeria until the 14th of March. Look out, Tackling Economic Crime Awards for all of those involved in the fraud world. These are open on the 28th of March, and the Cyber Oscars, massive worldwide, opens on the 11th of April. Look out for those, please. Now, listen, if you're in the UK, and I know some of you are, then be aware. 24th of February in the afternoon, a thought leadership summit recovering some of the most pressing issues affecting the sector. Make sure you know about that. And in the evening, if you miss this, then you're missing the big night of the year in the UK security sector, the UK Oscars, Black Pie 2. Let me tell you, all the leading players in the security sector are going to be at that. You can't afford not to be. 24th of February. And finally, we go through it all again next week, when our topic will be, when is political violence a business problem? 3 panelists, one of who's going to argue businesses are the problem. So very much hope to see you next week. Thank you very much indeed to Sarah Gray in the background. Thank you very much indeed to my panel for their engaging conversation. To you, the audience, for asking questions. Hopefully I'll see you next Thursday. But until then, wherever you are in the world, stay safe.